At 2:17 on July 6, 1945, 23,000 feet above the Philippine Sea, 40 miles east of Okinawa, the darkness was absolute. Not the darkness of a moonless night on the ground, where eyes adjust and shadows emerge, and the world reveals itself in gradations of gray. This was the darkness of high altitude over open ocean, where there is no ambient light, no reference point, no horizon line to separate sky from sea. The pilot could see nothing through his canopy except the faint green glow of his instrument panel, and reflected in the plexiglass, his own face rendered ghostly by the phosphorescence. The air at this altitude was thin and cold, the kind of cold that seeped through flight suits and leather gloves and turned breath to frost on oxygen masks. The engines, too, Pratt & Whitney, are two 800 double Wasps. 18 cylinders each, 4,000 horsepower combined produced their steady rumble, a bass note that filled the cockpit and vibrated through the airframe. It was a sound that had become, over 6 months of night patrols, almost comforting. The sound of power, the sound of American engineering, the sound of being the hunter rather than the hunted. Lieutenant Dale Haberman, 24 years old. From a farm outside Des Moines that seemed to exist in a different universe from this one, flew the P-61 Black Widow, the kind of relaxed competence that comes from 500 hours in type and the knowledge that his aircraft was the most sophisticated night fighter in the world. Behind him, separated by the elongated fuselage that connected the twin-tail booms, sat his radar operator, Flight Officer Robert Chen, 22, a first-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, who could read the green scope in front of him the way a musician reads sheet music. In the upper turret, now locked forward due to buffeting issues that had plagued early models, sat their gunner, Sergeant William Bill Morrison, 20, from Brooklyn, whose job had evolved from firing the defensive armament to serving as an extra pair of eyes and occasional navigator. They had been airborne for 2 hours and 17 minutes. They had seen nothing. The radar scope had shown nothing but occasional sea return, the ghostly echoes of waves far below. This was normal. Most night patrols ended without contact. The Pacific was vast, the darkness was deep, and the Japanese, by the summer of 1945, were husbanding their remaining aircraft for missions they deemed critical. Harassment raids on Okinawa had decreased. The night sky belonged increasingly to American aircraft flying unopposed. Their only enemy, boredom and the creeping cold. Then Chen's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but carrying an undercurrent of sudden intensity. Contact. Bearing 045, range 12 miles, Angels 2-1. Multiple returns. Count for possibly 5. Haberman felt his pulse kick up. For contacts. That meant bombers, almost certainly. Japanese night harassment raids typically flew in small formations. Oh, good. Trying to slip through the defensive perimeter and drop ordnance on the airfields and supply dumps that covered Okinawa like a rash. They came in low and fast or high and hoping to avoid detection, and they had been a persistent nuisance since the island's capture in June. But they had not, until this moment. Encountered a P-61, the Japanese did not believe the Americans had an effective night fighter. They believed, because their intelligence had told them so, that American night defenses consisted of searchlights and anti-aircraft fire and perhaps the occasional radar-equipped patrol, but nothing with the speed and firepower to pose a serious threat. They believed this because it had been true for most of the war. It was no longer true. But the Japanese had not yet learned that lesson. Haberman banked the Black Widow toward the contact, gancing throttles, feeling the aircraft accelerate. "Talk to me, Bob. Give me a vector." Chen's eyes were locked on the scope, watching the blips move across the screen, calculating intercept angles with the speed of long practice. "Come right to 060. Closure rate good. Range now 10 miles. Targets maintaining heading 270. Speed approximately 180 knots. They're in trail formation, spacing about half a mile between each aircraft."
For bombers.
Probably Mitsubishi G4M Bettys or Yokozuka P-1Y Francis, the backbone of the Japanese Naval Air Force's bomber fleet. At this stage of the war, they were precious assets, each one representing resources the Japanese could barely spare. And they were flying straight and level, unaware that death was approaching at 300 miles per hour. Guided by technology they could neither see nor imagine, the P-61's radar was its soul. The -720 Seychelles rupees, built by Western Electric, was a marvel of American industrial innovation, a compact, airborne intercept radar that could detect aircraft at ranges up to 15 miles, track them, guide the fighter to intercept position, and hold contact all the way to visual range and beyond. It filled the nose of the P-61, its antenna rotating behind a plexiglass dome, sending out pulses of radio energy and listening for the echoes that bounce back from metal aircraft. Those echoes appeared on Chun's scope as bright green blips against a dark green background, abstract representations of concrete reality. Chen translated those abstractions into vectors, ranges, altitudes, and fed them to Haberman, who translated them into stick and rudder movements, throttle adjustments, the physical ballet of interception. This was warfare at a level of technological sophistication that would have seemed like science fiction a decade earlier. And it was about to demonstrate, once again, that the war in the Pacific was not just a contest of wills, but a contest of systems, industrial, technological, educational systems, and that the American system, for all its inefficiencies and contradictions, produced results that the Japanese system could not match. To understand the significance of what was about to happen in the darkness above the Philippine Sea requires understanding the evolution of night fighting in the Second World War and the particular challenges of the Pacific theater. Night combat aviation began in the First World War as a crude and dangerous affair, pilots flying by moonlight, trying to intercept zeppelins or bombers with little more than courage and luck to guide them. By the Second World War, it had evolved into a specialized discipline requiring dedicated aircraft, specialized equipment, and intensive training. The British led the way, developing radar-equipped night fighters like the Bristow, Beaufighter, and the de Havilland Mosquito to counter the Luftwaffe's night bombing campaign against British cities. The Germans countered with their own radar-equipped aircraft and developed sophisticated ground-controlled interception systems. Night fighting over Europe became a deadly chess match of technology and tactics, both sides constantly innovating and adapting. In the Pacific, night fighting developed differently. The Japanese initially held the advantage, their pilots skilled in night operations and their aircraft capable of operating from primitive forward airstrips. The Americans, focused on daylight operations and carrier warfare, lagged behind. Early attempts at night interception relied on conventional fighters, like the F-4U Corsair or F-6F Hellcat, equipped with primitive radar or simply flown by pilots with exceptional night vision. Results were mixed at best. The distances were too great, the darkness too complete, technology too unreliable. The P-61 Black Widow was designed to change that calculus. Northrop began development in 1940. After the British shared their early experiences with radar-equipped night fighters, the specifications called for an aircraft with long range, heavy armament, advanced radar, and the ability to operate in all weather conditions. What emerged was unlike any fighter that had come before, a massive twin-engine, twin-boom aircraft that weighed over 20,000 pounds empty and looked more like a small bomber than a conventional fighter. It was painted matte black to reduce visibility at night. It could fly for over 10 hours on internal fuel. Its 4 20mm cannon, mounted in a belly turret, could destroy an enemy bomber with a single burst. But the real weapon was the radar. The -720 Seychelles rupees gave the P-61 the ability to hunt in total darkness, to find enemies that had no idea they were being stalked, too close to firing range and kill before the target ever saw the attacker. It made night fighting not a matter of luck, but of systematic execution. And it gave American night fighters an advantage that Japanese pilots, trained in visual combat and relying on their own eyes, could not counter. The first P-61s arrived in the Pacific in the summer of 1944. Assigned to specialized night fighter squadrons operating from bases in New Guinea, the Philippines, and eventually Okinawa, they flew patrol routes over Allied territory, waiting for Japanese harassment raids that came in darkness, seeking to disrupt sleep, destroy supplies, kill the unwary. The Japanese bombers flew singly or in small formations. Navigating by dead reckoning and the occasional glimpse of starlight on water, they expected to encounter searchlights and flak, which they could evade through maneuver and altitude changes. They did not expect to encounter aircraft that could see them in the dark. The Japanese high command was aware that the Americans had some form of night fighting. Capability reports from bomber crews who had been attacked at night filtered back, along with the usual exaggerations and confusions that accompany combat. But Japanese intelligence consistently underestimated both the sophistication of American radar and the effectiveness of the Pi-61. This was partly technological. Biased Japanese radar development lagged significantly behind American and British efforts and, partly wishful thinking, acknowledging American superiority in this domain meant acknowledging a gap that could not easily be closed. So, Japanese bomber crews continued to fly night missions into the summer of 1945, operating on the assumption that darkness provided protection, that the Americans might get lucky occasionally, but could not systematically hunt them down. This assumption was about to be comprehensively disproven. Haberman brought the Black Widow to intercept heading, trimming the aircraft, letting the speed build. The radar returns were crisp now, for distinct contacts moving across Chen's scope. Range 7 miles, Chen reported. Targets still in trail. Lead aircraft at Angels 2-1. Looks like the others are stepped down slightly. Classic bombing approach formation. We're heading for Okinawa, Haberman realized. Probably targeting the airfields at Kadena or Yantan, trying to crater runways or destroy parked aircraft. It was a mission they would not complete. At 3 miles, Chen called, "Contact solid. You should have visuals soon if there's any starlight." There was not. The sky was overcast at high altitude, the stars blotted out. But the P-61 did not need stars. Haberman descended slightly to position himself below and behind the lead bomber, the classic stern attack position. At 1 mile, Chen called final range. Haberman's eyes strained into the darkness ahead, seeing nothing, trusting his instruments. Trusting Chen, trusting the radar. Then at 1,200 feet, he saw it. Not the aircraft itself, but a faint dark shape against the slightly less dark sky, a negative space where no stars shone. The lead bomber. He could not identify the type, there was not enough light, but he could see the silhouette. Twin engines. Mid-wing. The characteristic profile of a Japanese medium bomber. He eased the throttles back slightly, matching speed, closing to 600 feet. The bomber crew had no idea he was there. No idea that the darkness they trusted to protect them was about to betray them. Haberman armed the cannon. For 20 mm Hispano autocannon, mounted in the Pi-61's belly. Each loaded with a belt of high-explosive incendiary rounds. Firing rate, 600 rounds per minute per gun. Time to empty all magazines, approximately 10 seconds of continuous fire. Effective range, 1,000 yards. Haberman was at 600 feet, 200 yards, point blank. He centered the dark shape in his gun sight, a simple, illuminated reticle, barely visible in the darkness. He took a breath. He pressed the firing button. The night exploded. The cannon roared, their muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like strobe lights, the recoil shuddering through the airframe. Haberman saw his rounds walk into the bomber's starboard wing, saw the flashes as they impacted, saw pieces tear away. He held the button down for 3 seconds, adjusting aim slightly left, tracking the fuselage. Then the bomber's fuel tanks erupted, a brilliant orange fireball that bloomed in the darkness like a malignant flower, illuminating the night for 1,000 yards in every direction. The sudden light revealed everything. The bomber, now. A tumbling mass of flame and wreckage. The second bomber, 500 yards ahead and below, banking hard left in panic. The third and fourth bombers, farther ahead, scattering. Haberman pulled up hard to avoid the fireball, felt the heat even through the canopy, and rolled left to pursue the second target. Time elapsed since first contact, for minutes. Time since first kill, 12 seconds. Bombers remaining, 3. The element of surprise was gone. The remaining Japanese crews knew they were under attack. though they almost certainly did not know by what. In the brief illumination from the fireball, they might have caught a glimpse of the Black Widow, but at night, at these speeds, it would have been fragmentary at best. What they knew for certain was that one of their formation had just been destroyed explosively and without warning. Their training called for evasive maneuvers, but evasive maneuvers against what? An enemy they could not see, using weapons they did not understand? Chen was already tracking the second bomber on radar. Contact bearing 350, range 2 miles, descending. He's diving for the deck. Standard evasion tactic, drop to low altitude, where radar was less effective due to ground clutter. It might have worked against earlier American radar systems. It did not work against the SCR-720, which had been designed specifically to counter this tactic. Haberman pushed the nose down, following building speed. The second bomber was silhouetted briefly against a patch of lighter sky, then disappeared into the general murk. No matter. Chen had him on scope. Range 1 mile, closure good. Target leveling off at Angels 1-5. 15,000 feet, lower air, warmer air, but still desperately cold and still desperately dark. The Japanese pilot was flying by instruments now, had to be, with no visual references except perhaps the faint glow of phosphorescence on the ocean far below. He was trying to run, opening throttles, coaxing every bit of speed from his engines. A Betty or a Francis could make perhaps 300 knots at full throttle in a dive. The P-61 could make 400. Haberman closed the distance in 90 seconds. Again, the dark shape resolved from the darkness ahead. Wings and tail and engines in a configuration his mind processed and identified. G4M, Betty, flying straight now. The pilot having exhausted his options, perhaps hoping distance would save him, it would not. This time Haberman fired from 800 feet, a longer shot, but well within effective range. The cannon spoke again, that distinctive hammering roar, and rounds tore into the bomber's fuselage and port engine. The engine caught fire immediately, the cowling blowing off, propeller windmilling, and then separating, tumbling away into the darkness. The bomber nosed down, the pilot trying to maintain control with one engine gone, and the airframe shredded. Haberman gave him another burst, aiming for the wing root. The wing folded, the bomber rolled inverted, and began its final plunge toward the sea 7,000 feet below. Haberman did not watch it fall. He was already climbing, following Chun's vectors to the third target. Time elapsed since first kill, 18 minutes. Bombers destroyed, 2. Bombers remaining, 2. The third and fourth bombers had separated, each pilot making the rational decision that formation discipline was less important than survival. They were running for home, or trying to, heading generally west toward Japanese-held territory. But they were 200 miles from safety, and they were being hunted by an aircraft that was faster, better armed, and equipped with technology that made darkness irrelevant. Chen tracked the third bomber, called vectors, and Haberman followed with the mechanical precision of a predator that has tasted blood. The intercept took longer this time. The Japanese pilot was jinking, changing altitude and heading randomly, hoping to break radar lock. It did not work. The SCR-720 was too good. Chen was too skilled, and random maneuvers consumed fuel and time the bomber did not have. Asterisk at 23 minutes after the first kill. Haberman closed to firing range for the third time. This bomber was a Francis. He could tell from the profile, the distinctive nose and tail configuration. It was flying at 19,000 feet, heading to a 5 degrees speed, approximately 240 knots. Slower than the Bettys? More vulnerable, he fired. The cannon shells streaked across the intervening space. Each one, a packet of high explosive and incendiary material traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. They hit the Francis in the fuselage and tail section. One must have found the bomb bay, because the bomber disintegrated, simply came apart in a massive explosion that briefly turned night to day and sent debris spinning in all directions. Haberman flew through the expanding fireball, felt the concussion buffet the Black Widow, pulled through and climbed, adrenaline singing in his veins. 3 down, 1 to go. The fourth bomber was 15 miles ahead, diving for the ocean, the pilot pushing his aircraft to its limits. Chen acquired the contact, fed vectors, and Haberman pursued. This was no longer combat. It was execution. The Japanese crew had to know they were being hunted, had to have seen the fireballs behind them, had to understand that whatever was hunting them was unstoppable. But there was nowhere to go, no safe harbor, no dawn that would bring visibility and perhaps allied fighters to help. Just darkness and distance, and the gradually closing gap between hunter and prey. The chase lasted 23 minutes. 23 minutes of Chen calling ranges and bearings, of Haberman managing throttles and trim, of the steady thunder of the double Wasp engines pushing the Black Widow through the night. The Japanese bomber descended to wave-top height, perhaps hoping to lose itself against the sea return on radar. But Chen held the contact, and Haberman descended with the target, dropping to 500 feet, then 300, dangerously low for night flying, but necessary to complete the mission. At 81 minutes after first contact, Haberman closed to firing range for the fourth and final time. The bomber was skimming the waves, so low that Haberman could see the faint white trails of wingtip vortices disturbing the dark water. He positioned himself dead astern, slightly above, and fired his last extended burst. The cannon had perhaps 3 seconds of ammunition remaining, and he used all of it. The rounds shredded the bomber's tail and fuselage. The aircraft nosed down, too low to recover, and struck the water at 240 knots. The impact was catastrophic, the bomber disintegrating on contact, sending up a plume of white spray that was briefly visible before the darkness swallowed it. Then there was nothing except the sound of the Pi-61's engines and the intercom crackle, and the knowledge that 4 Japanese bombers had entered this patch of sky and none would leave. It time from first. Radar contact of fourth kill, 80 minutes. Ammunition expended. Approximately 600 rounds of 20 millimeters. Fuel state, sufficient to return to base. Damage to the P-61, none. Haberman turned for home, climbing to altitude, letting the adrenaline bleed off. Behind him, Chen was already writing notes for the combat report, recording times and positions in the sequence of events. Morrison, who had witnessed the entire engagement from the turret, was silent, processing what he had seen. They landed at Kadena at 0512 hours, just as the first gray light of dawn was beginning to show on the eastern horizon. The ground crew swarmed the aircraft, examining it for damage, finding none. The armorer checked the cannon magazines, confirmed they were empty, and began the process of reloading. The intelligence officer debriefed the crew, taking detailed notes, already thinking about how this action would be written up, what it meant for tactics and strategy, and the prosecution of the air war over Japan. 4 confirmed kills in a single sortie. It was, by any measure, an exceptional performance. But more than that, it was a demonstration of what American technology, properly applied, could accomplish. A single P-61, crewed by 3 men, had destroyed a Japanese bombing raid before it could reach its target, had done so with such efficiency that the enemy had no opportunity to fight back, no chance to evade, no hope of survival, had done so in conditions absolute darkness. Over open ocean where visual combat was impossible and traditional fighter tactics were useless. The Japanese learned of the loss of the bomber formation when the aircraft failed to return to base. They did not learn the details. There were no survivors to report what had happened. They knew only that 4 bombers had vanished, presumably shot down somewhere between their last radio check and Okinawa. Over the following weeks, as more bombing raids were intercepted and destroyed by P-61s, the pattern became clear. The Americans had something new, something deadly, something that could hunt in the dark with near-perfect effectiveness. The Japanese response was to reduce night operations dramatically. The cost had become unsustainable. Every bomber sent out at night was a bomber likely not to return. The few that did return brought tales of attacks by invisible enemies, of being shot down without ever seeing their attacker, of feeling hunted by ghosts. The psychological impact was profound. Japanese aircrew morale, already low by mid-1945, took another hit. Why fly missions that were suicide? Why continue to fight when the enemy possessed technology so superior that resistance was futile? These were dangerous questions for a military culture built on the foundation of Bushido, the warrior code that valorized sacrifice and obedience unto death. But they were questions that could not be avoided. The evidence was too stark. The Americans were not just winning the war. They were winning it with a technological superiority that made Japanese courage and determination irrelevant. What did it matter that Japanese pilots were willing to die when American pilots could kill them from beyond visual range? In darkness, with weapons guided by radio pulses and cathode ray tubes, the Pi-61's radar scope became, in its way, a symbol of the larger American advantage in the Pacific War. Not just technological advantage, though that was real, but systemic advantage. The radar existed because American universities produced physicists and engineers who understood electromagnetic theory. It was manufactured because American factories could produce precision electronics at scale. It was deployed because American logistics could move complex equipment, cross thousands of miles of ocean, and maintain it in forward operating areas. It was effective because American training programs produced radar operators like Chen, who could interpret green blips on a screen and translate them into tactical advantage. Every element of that chain education, research, manufacturing, logistics, training reflected a society that had mobilized its full capacity for war while maintaining the fundamental characteristics that made it a democracy. Decentralized decision-making, protection of intellectual property that incentivized innovation, labor systems that valued skill, educational institutions that promoted critical thinking rather than rote obedience. The Japanese system, for all its emphasis on discipline and sacrifice, could not replicate these advantages because they were not compatible with authoritarian control. The radar scope's green glow, visible only to the operator hunched over it in the darkened fuselage of a P-61, represented the sum total of American industrial, scientific, and educational achievement applied to the problem of war. It was the visible manifestation of an invisible superiority, not of individual soldiers, who were no braver or more skilled than their Japanese counterparts, but of the system that equipped and supported them in the weeks and months following Haberman's 4-kill mission. The P-61 continued to dominate the night skies over the Pacific. By war's end, Black Widow squadrons had destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft, the vast majority at night, the vast majority without ever being seen by their targets. The kill ratio was staggeringly lopsided. Japanese night operations, which had been a nuisance and occasionally a serious threat to American forces, dwindled to near zero. The men who flew the P-61s did not see themselves as instruments of systemic superiority. They saw themselves as doing a job, applying their training, using the tools they had been given. Haberman, in his combat report, as matter of fact, to the point of terseness, intercepted and engaged for enemy bombers. All 4 destroyed. No damage to own aircraft. Radar performance excellent. The language was professional, unemotional. The language of a mechanic describing repairs made to a machine. But the implications were profound. Every Japanese aircraft that failed to return from a night mission was an aircraft that could not attack American positions, could not disrupt American operations, could not kill American soldiers. Every raid intercepted was a victory, not just tactically but strategically, eroding Japanese capability to resist, demonstrating the futility of continued fighting. The Pi-61's success contributed in its incremental way to the larger calculus that led to Japanese surrender in August 1945, after the war. When historians analyzed the Pacific campaign, the P-61 was a footnote. The great battles midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa dominated the narrative. The strategic bombing campaign, the submarine war against Japanese shipping, the island-hopping strategy that brought American forces to Japan's doorstep received extensive coverage. The night fighters were mentioned briefly, if at all, their contributions subsumed into the larger category of air superiority, but the men who fought against them remembered. Japanese veterans interviewed decades later spoke of the terror of night missions in the war's final months, of knowing that darkness no longer provided protection, that American aircraft could find and kill them regardless of conditions. One former bomber pilot, speaking in the 1980s, said, "We thought night was our ally. We thought if we flew in darkness, we would be safe. Then your Black Widows came, and we learned that you had turned night into your weapon. You could see in the dark. We could not. This was when I knew we had lost, not because you were braver, but because you had made the night itself fight for you." That perception that Americans had bent natural law to their advantage, that they possessed capabilities that seemed almost supernatural, was more demoralizing than battlefield defeats. It suggested a gap not just in equipment, but in fundamental capability. A gap that could not be closed through effort or sacrifice. It meant that no amount of courage would be sufficient. That the war was lost not on moral grounds, but on material and technological grounds. Asterisk. This was deeply troubling to a military culture that had been taught to believe in the primacy of spirit over matter, of will over technology, of the warrior's heart over the enemy's machines. The P-61, with its radar and its cannon and its invisible presence in the night sky, was the refutation of that belief. It proved that spirit alone was insufficient, that technology mattered, that industrial capacity and scientific innovation were force multipliers, more potent than any amount of ideological indoctrination. The green glow of the radar scope, then, was more than a tool of war. It was evidence of a different kind of society, one that invested in education and research, that rewarded innovation, that built systems complex enough to produce and deploy technology at the cutting edge of what was possible. The Japanese could build good aircraft, they did. They could train skilled pilots, they did. But they could not, within the constraints of their system, match the systematic application of scientific and industrial resources that produced the P-61 and everything it tied. Represented Dale Haberman returned to Iowa after the war. He did not speak much about his combat missions, deflecting questions with the standard veteran's response, "I did my job, nothing special. Lots of guys did more." He married, farmed, raised children, lived an ordinary life that gave no external sign of what he had done in the darkness over the Pacific. His 4-kill mission was recorded in official records, earned him a Distinguished Flying Cross, and was forgotten by everyone except those who had been there. Robert Chin went back to San Francisco, used the GI Bill to attend university, earned a degree in electrical engineering, and spent a career working on radar systems for civilian aviation. The skills he had learned in the back of a P-61 reading scopes, interpreting returns, translating electronic signals into spatial awareness, translated directly into peacetime applications. Radar became ubiquitous in the decades after the war, guiding aircraft, tracking weather, enabling technologies that transformed society. Chen was part of that transformation. One of thousands of veterans who took military training and applied it to civilian ends, William Morrison settled in New York, worked in construction, raised a family, and almost never mentioned the war. When asked, he would say he had been a gunner, and people assumed he had fired at enemies, and he did not correct them. The truth that he had been a witness to executions carried out with technological precision in the darkness, thousands of feet above a black ocean, was not something he knew how to explain. It was not heroic in the conventional sense. It was just efficient. Grimly, terrifyingly efficient. The P-61 itself did not survive long into the post-war period. Jet aircraft were already replacing propeller-driven fighters, and specialized night fighters were being integrated into all-weather interceptor roles. The Black Widow was too big, too slow, too specialized for the emerging needs of the Cold War Air Force. Most were scrapped. A few were preserved in museums, their matte black paint fading to gray, their radar scopes dark and silent, their cannon barrels plugged. They sit now as artifacts, physical evidence of a moment when technology made possible what had previously been impossible. The systematic hunting and killing of enemies in complete darkness. But the legacy of the P-61 is not primarily in the aircraft itself. It is in what the aircraft represented: the application of scientific innovation to military problems, the integration of complex systems into effective weapons platforms, the creation of new tactical capabilities through technology. These became hallmarks of American military doctrine in the decades that followed. The radar-guided missiles of the Cold War, the precision-guided munitions of the Gulf War, the drone strikes of the 21st century are descendants of the same principle embodied in the P-61. That technology, properly applied, can make the impossible routine. The Japanese learned this lesson in the darkness over the Philippine Sea, and in 1,000 similar engagements across the Pacific. They learned that their enemy possessed not just more aircraft and more ships and more men, but a fundamentally different approach to war, one that systematized innovation, that turned science into weaponry, that treated technology not as a supplement to human valor, but as a force multiplier that made human valor exponentially more effective. The green glow of the radar scope was the face of that approach. It was cold, impersonal, ruthlessly efficient. It did not care about courage or sacrifice or the warrior code. It simply displayed information, range, bearing, altitude, and left the human operators to act on that information. And when they acted, when pilots like Haberman pressed the firing button and sent streams of 20mm shells into unsuspecting bombers, the results were not glorious or heroic. They were just final. 4 bombers disappeared in 80 minutes. For crews, each composed of men with families and histories and futures, ceased to exist. Their aircraft tumbled into the dark ocean or exploded in midair, taking with them the photographs in their pockets and the letters they intended to write, and the hopes they had harbored for survival. This was the arithmetic of war. The grim calculus that measured success in enemy, destroyed and missions accomplished. But it was also something more. It was evidence of a larger truth about the nature of modern warfare and the societies that wage it. Wars are not won by individual acts of heroism, though those matter. They are not won by courage or determination, though those are necessary. They are won by systems, by economies that can outproduce the enemy, by educational systems that can out-innovate the enemy, by logistics systems that can outsupply the enemy, by technological systems that can outperform the enemy. The P-61, with its radar and its cannon and its ability to kill unseen in the night, was the product of such systems. It was what emerged when a democratic society, with all its messy inefficiencies and contradictions, focused its collective capacity on the problem of war. That society valued education and science. It protected innovation through patents and intellectual property rights. It allowed individuals like the designers at Northrop and the engineers at Western Electric to pursue solutions without ideological constraints. It trained young men like Chen to operate complex equipment and trusted them to make tactical decisions in the heat of combat. The Japanese system, authoritarian and top-down, could not replicate these conditions. It could demand sacrifice and obedience. It could not demand innovation, because innovation requires freedom to fail, to question, to approach problems from unexpected angles. It could build good aircraft through centralized planning. But it could not create the ecosystem of universities and private companies and competitive markets that produce breakthrough technologies like airborne radar. And so, in the darkness above the Pacific, the two systems met, and one proved superior. Not morally superior. War is not a moral enterprise, but functionally superior. The American system produced tools that allowed 3 men in a single aircraft to destroy 4 enemy bombers in 80 minutes. The Japanese system produced brave men flying vulnerable aircraft who died without ever seeing their killer. The story of that night of Haberman and Chen and Morrison hunting in the dark, of Japanese bomber crews trying to complete their mission and dying in flames, is a microcosm of the larger war. It illustrates the point where technology and training and systemic advantage combined to create outcomes that defied the expectations of an enemy who had been taught to believe in the primacy of spirit and will. The Japanese thought one P-61 in the dark was a myth because their worldview did not accommodate the reality of what American technology had achieved. They thought night provided protection because it always had. They thought courage and determination were sufficient because their ideology insisted they were. And then for bombers vanished in 80 minutes. And the myth became reality, and the protection became illusion. And the ideology cracked under the weight of evidence. The green glow of the radar scope was the last thing Robert Chen saw before closing his eyes after the mission. The afterimage burned into his retinas. It was the light of knowledge, cold and green and inescapable. showing targets where there should have been only darkness. It was the light of a different kind of power, not the power of muscles and machines alone, but the power of understanding, of bending electromagnetic radiation to human purposes, of making the invisible visible. That light represented everything the P-61 was and everything it symbolized: American ingenuity, American industrial capacity, American faith in technology and science, American willingness to invest in education and research even in the midst of total war. It was the light of a society that, for all its flaws, had created conditions where innovation flourished and where the fruits of that innovation could be deployed with devastating effectiveness. The Japanese had no equivalent. They had courage and discipline in aircraft that were, in some ways, equal or superior to American designs. But they did not have the radar. They did not have the system that produced the radar. They did not have the society that produced the system that produced the radar. And in the end, that made all the difference. 4 bombers disappeared in 80 minutes. And the lesson was written in fire across the night sky, that wars are won not by myth or will alone, but by the systematic application of knowledge, resources, and technology. That darkness is only protection until someone invents a way to see in the dark. That the impossible becomes possible when science and engineering and industrial capacity are brought to bear on the problem. The P-61 flew through darkness and made it light. The radar scope glowed green and revealed hidden enemies. The cannon fired and destroyed those enemies with mechanical precision, and in doing so, they demonstrated a truth that extended far beyond that single night, that single engagement, that single war, that free societies, with their messy democracies and competitive markets and protected intellectual freedoms, can produce innovations that authoritarian systems cannot match, not because free people are braver or better, but because free systems allow for the kind of distributed problem-solving and rapid innovation that centralized control inhibits. The Japanese thought one P-61 in the dark was a myth. Then the myth destroyed 4 bombers in 80 minutes, and the darkness was no longer safe. And the night belonged to the hunters with the green glowing scopes and the cannon that spoke with thunder. And in that transformation, in that moment when myth became reality and protection became vulnerability, the larger trajectory of the war was written small, a contest between systems decided by technology, measured in the green glow of a radar scope that saw what eyes could not and made the invisible fatally visible. Thanks for watching. Hit like, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more real WW2 stories every day.